This is Matt Regier with my case study for EDL 850, Copyright and the Computer Regulations Governing Technology. So first, a summary of who's involved in the case. Mr. Sample is the third-year principal at the St. Regis School. Mrs. Lynn is the library and media specialist and the computer laboratory teacher who has taken over the responsibility of allocating software and scheduling the computer lab. Mrs. Brandon is a new teacher in the district with experience in a larger district, and she's the one that has kind of called out Mrs. Lynn's potential copyright violations. And then there's the St. Regis PTA and the community at large that really supports their school. So what's happening in St. Regis? St. Regis is a small K-8 school with limited computer access for their students. They've just purchased some new software, and Mrs. Lynn has taken it upon herself to make some copies of that new software to distribute to classrooms for increased usage. They already have a computer lab that's been being utilized consistently, and she has decided to make some copies so that it can be utilized in individual classrooms. Mrs. Brandon has alerted Mr. Sample about the possibility of a copyright violation, and Mr. Sample has addressed both Mrs. Brandon and Mrs. Lynn about the potential effects of that, and they're starting to chart a path forward. There are definitely some legal and ethical issues involved here. Copyright law restricts the reproduction of multiple copies without permission from the author, and this software would fall under that. There's been multiple copies created. There's not been any permission granted from what we know, so this would be a violation of copyright. There's a low chance of being caught for that, but there's still the ethical dilemma of using illegal software as you're teaching your students that they need to properly cite sources, that they need to be responsible with data, and that they need to follow laws. So there's an ethical dilemma beyond the legal dilemma. And Mr. Sample also needs to retain the support of the community and the PTA. He has pretty good support. He's still kind of considered an outsider, and he needs to retain and even grow that support through his response here. So Mr. Sample must help his staff and community to find a legal path to better computer access for their students. So putting these facts together to get a comprehensive synthesis of the case, Mr. Sample is balancing legality and the continued support of his staff and community. That's definitely a delicate balance, especially when you have parents involved, to balance that parent support with following the laws and regulations that schools need to follow. Mrs. Lynn is a budget-conscious teacher, and she wants to help her teachers reach their students. She's resourceful. She's trying to go out of her way to make this software available to her students, and she's putting in extra effort to do so. Mrs. Brandon is concerned about copyright violations. She's also looking out for students in the school, but mostly from a legal perspective at this point, and using her experience in a larger district. And the PTA and Mrs. Evans, as its president, are very involved in the school. They're very financially supportive, but they're also frugal and want St. Regis to spend their dollars well. St. Regis is a small school of about 420 students. They're 25 miles from the nearest city. It's a rural, tight-knit community that's pretty resistant to outsiders, and the community, again, is very supportive of the school. And the software itself is elementary school software purchased for the computer lab using money from those PTA fundraisers. So using that support from the community to purchase it. It was copied then for individual classrooms and distributed to teachers. So who will this impact? There's potential damage to several parties here. The children, first and foremost, could be damaged or impacted by limited access to the software. The whole goal of this software was to provide additional educational opportunities for the students, and limiting their access will impact them. It is worth noting that this was extra access beyond the computer lab. They would still be able to access it in the lab, but not in their individual classrooms. Mr. Sample could also have some damage here, some impact. He's gained a position in the community. He's gained some influence in the community, and that can certainly take a hit if he responds poorly to this. There's a strong bond right now between the school and the PTA that could be fractured. The software company is negatively impacted when illegal copies are made. And Mrs. Lynn and her fellow teachers could certainly experience some friction based on how this plays out. So who has a stake here? The stakeholders include Mr. Sample, of course, the teachers, especially Mrs. Lynn and Mrs. Brandon, the software company, and the PTA members that have some stake um, as the purchasers of the software. The children, of course, have a stake here, but they're not necessarily a major player in how the decision will be made. So Mr. Sample is tasked with constructing a response. So he's obviously been consulted. Uh, the teachers, Mrs. Lynn has been consulted, and Mrs. Brandon may have some additional ideas about ways to get students access from her former experiences. So she may be worth an additional consultation. The software company should be contacted and at least ask for permission to copy the software. It's doubtful that they would say yes, but it's worth asking or calling. And then the PTA members should be kept informed as decisions are made, perhaps brought in small groups, but they should not be included in the initial decision-making process simply because of the legality portion. So are we ready for a decision? Mr. Sample has a few more things that he could learn. First, will the company grant permission to copy the software? Again, it's a likely no, but it's worth asking. Uh, he needs to consult his district's acceptable use policy that covers this type of scenario. If the district has a policy, that gives him a very clear and clean path to resolution. If not, and it seems that they don't, he needs to take further steps to eventually get one, but also to solve this problem that's at hand. And then he needs to consider whether there are grants available to small rural schools for software purchases. If there's money available for his PTA or for his school to go after and apply for, there might be an easier path to funding this software than was initially thought. With this information, there should be enough for a decision. So what should Mr. Sample do? There's several options. First, he could just allow the copying to continue with no action. He could communicate with Mrs. Brandon about the necessity of the software for student access and allow it to continue on. He could also destroy the copies and keep the software only in the computer lab, restrict it just to the computer lab, and communicate with Mrs. Lynn that the legal ramifications are just too great to risk. And he could talk to the PTA about how the software can't be copied due to copyright and just leave it at that. He could also allow the copying to continue until next year, when additional copies could be purchased legally. He could communicate with Mrs. Brandon that the situation would be rectified next year, that this would be a bridge solution, and he could also inform the PTA and Mrs. Lynn to thank them of their resourcefulness, but that this would only be a bridge solution until more copies could be purchased. Another option that he could choose would be to destroy the copies and ask Mrs. Lynn, perhaps some PTA members, to find and write grants to procure funds for software purchase. He'd need to thank Mrs. Lynn for her effort and then try to redirect that effort to grant writing or applying for other funds. This would also entail destroying the copies with the plan to buy more soon as funds are made available. Another option might be to seek out a company or group nearby to solicit funds to help support the purchase of additional software. They could use the PTA connections in the nearby large city to find those funds, to perhaps find a donor or a business that would be willing to support them. And then number 6, they could create an additional fundraiser in addition to the 2 annual fundraisers that the St. Regis School draws its support from to purchase the new software rather quickly. They would need to ask the PTA group to help organize and run that fundraiser. So some pros and cons. For option number 1, no action, just allowing the copying to continue. There's definitely some pros. The software access would be maintained. He would probably maintain good favor in the community, and there's a system already in place for that software. It's already been delivered to the students and to the classrooms. That's already been done. The cons, this option is in clear violation of copyright, and the option has some ethical issues that would be really hard to reconcile or defend. Option 2 would be to destroy the copies and keep the software only in the lab. The pros here is that it's legal and that there's a clear direction. It's very obvious and clear what the decision is. Unfortunately, this might erode support for Mr. Sample. The PTA members have donated time, they've donated money, and they appreciate frugality. The teachers also want the best for their students, and they're trying to be resourceful. This also leads to limited access to the software for the students. Option 3 would be to allow the copying to continue until next year and then purchase some additional copies. The pros here are widespread access for students. It likely maintains support for Mr. Sample from both Mrs. Brandon and the rest of the staff and community, and there's a clear path to legality here. It's going to take some time, and there will be some bending of the law in the meantime, but there is a path to legality. The cons are that this still violates copyright for the remainder of the year. There's an additional cost to the district or to the community to purchase more software, and there's some possible frustration over those added costs from the PTA that feels like they've done a good job of stretching dollars. For option 4, destroying the copies and asking Mrs. Lynn to find and write grants for software purchase. The pros here are that this is first a legal option. There's minimal or no cost to the district and community. This redirects the great efforts of Mrs. Lynn on scheduling and on being resourceful to stretch dollars to a productive, legal, and meaningful task. And grant funding may be discovered to supplant fundraising for other needs, so it might help their dollars stretch even further than they initially thought. The cons here is that it would require substantial effort. There would be limited access to the software until those funds are available. And with a grant, there is no guaranteed funding. They would have to be selected for the grant after they apply. Option 5 would be to seek out a company or group in the nearby city to support the purchase of additional software. The pros here are that it makes use of existing connections and that there's a large number of potential donors in relatively close proximity to the school. They do live 25 miles from a large city. There's likely some workers in that city that live in St. Regis's school district. So they may have some connections they don't know about or haven't tapped into yet. The cons here are that this is a one-time option, most likely, and it's not guaranteed. They may have to find a diamond in the rough, and there may not be a diamond there. And then it's also a challenge to solicit funds with no clear benefit for the giver, especially if that giver may not have children or relatives in the St. Regis district. And then option 6 would be to create an additional fundraiser to purchase more software. The pros here is that it makes use of the existing PTA structure for fundraisers. It's again a legal means of procuring funds. But the cons here are that it would take a lot of additional work from a lot of people in all likelihood to create an additional fundraiser from nothing. It'll take time to organize, and that time will be while the students are without the software, and that it would draw funds from the same sources as other fundraisers. The same community resources would be tapped into, and eventually those resources will either run dry or probably grow tired of being tapped for fundraising consistently. So the choice. This is a difficult choice, and there's lots of options here. I would go with option 4, to destroy the copies and ask Mrs. Lynn to find and write grants for software purchase. The choice is legal, and while that will be hard for Mrs. Lynn to swallow, it does offer a clear pathway for access. The efforts of Mrs. Lynn and the PTA first can be acknowledged and thanked, and then can be redirected into a positive and productive effort. There'd be no additional funds required from the community, and this may be as simple as a donors choose page or that sort of a grant. It might be a much larger grant that might leverage the rural limitations of the school as a strength. This school seems proud and almost defensive at times of their small rural size, and there are grants out there for schools in that situation. There are rural technology grants that seek to provide equitable access to technology to schools in a variety of different scenarios. So maybe that apparent weakness could be leveraged as a strength, which I think would be well received from the community here. So implementation, how does this get put into action? First, Mr. Sample needs to consult Mrs. Brandon about ways that her former school provided access to students. I think this is an important first step, perhaps as a bridge between the current illegal solution and the final solution that hopefully leads to the purchase of new software with grant money. Second, he needs to speak with Mrs. Lynn and Mrs. Evans. He needs to thank them both for their efforts and explain the potential consequences of the copyright infringement, the legal ramifications, and the ethical dilemma that it would put him and the district in. After that, he needs to propose a grant writing team to apply for additional software purchases. Uh, Again, this would supplement fundraisers, perhaps more than they expect. There would be no community cost here, so it is continuing to stretch those dollars that's so important to St. Regis. The size and location of the school can be utilized as a strength, and he can emphasize how this can help stretch the dollars and promote success for the St. Regis students. After those two discussions, he needs to communicate with the broader staff about the plan of action to ensure student access and success. He needs to explain to the staff, again, the legal and ethical ramifications, but also that there is a plan in place for broader access and that they have someone to lead that effort with Mrs. Lynn, and that if they want to contribute to that effort, there's a great way for them to do so. And then Mr. Sample also needs to create or revise an acceptable use policy for his district in order to deal with similar situations in the future. Having written policy on something like this is invaluable. It will give him something to refer back to in a future scenario or a similar scenario that may occur later, but also for his successors and administrators that may come after him or work in the same district. This would give them a clear piece of policy that they could refer to. And this should be done regardless of the option that's chosen or the results of those actions. If this option doesn't work out, there still needs to be an acceptable use policy put into place. So what might happen? First, you hope that Mrs. Lynn and Mrs. Evans agree and get to work. The PTA could back Mrs. Lynn as she leads the grant writing team. Again, perhaps this looks like a donors choose page. Perhaps it's a much more substantial grant writing project that procures funds that are greater than what's necessary for just some additional software purchasing. Mrs. Lynn and Mrs. Evans may push back about destroying those copies. I would hope that they would have enough faith in Mr. Sample to proceed with the plan, even if they don't totally agree with it. But if not, I would ask them to evaluate the laws and messaging to students if they continue to use those illegal copies. The goal here would be to get them to arrive at the conclusion that using illegal copies really isn't a viable option for a school district. I'd also invite them then to be partners in devising a legal solution for student access. They may prefer a fundraiser, they may prefer to just solicit funds for additional copies, and that'd be fine. But I would invite them to be partners in coming up with that so that there's some shared accountability about the cost to the community, whether that's a cost of time or a cost of financial dollars, so that they would be able to put their names on it along with Mr. Sample to continue and keep that support that he's worked so hard to build. I'd offer the ideas from other options considered earlier, accepting, of course, the one where no action is taken. And then I would also possibly invite Mrs. Brandon to share alternative ideas from her previous school, partly to bring her into the team and hopefully create staff cohesion, but also because she may have some very, very good ideas for ways to stretch those dollars and stretch that access for their students. I think with this solution, both Mrs. Lynn and Mrs. Brandon will feel valued as members of the staff. Mrs. Evans and the parents will feel that their support and their contributions are valued and important, that their dollars are being stretched and stewarded wisely by the school, and Mr. Sample will be able to maintain his support and continue working for the best for the St. Regis students.